Hello, I'm just going to show you how to do a little long polling application using Lumen 5.2 and Vue.js 1016. This is a really simple tutorial. It's mostly about long polling itself and not necessarily about Lumen or Vue. But there is some nice little things that we can take advantage of in Lumen and Laravel and Vue to make this app pretty snappy, or at least work much better than these traditional long polling applications used to work. So if you don't know what long polling is, it's essentially just a loop that's being run and fetching data from the server. So you can see I have this my network traffic here, and every 5 seconds I'm doing a new request and I'm fetching all of the tasks. And because I'm using Vue on the front end, Vue is going to calculate, well, what's changed? If nothing's changed, my DOM isn't actually going to change. But let's say I check off one of these tasks, you can see a request was just made here, a post request. And now if anyone else is connected to this front end, they'll actually see these changes. So we can actually make a new task, so new task with info, it's completed, we'll see that that's there, and then you see it pops up here. So I'm not using any WebSockets. That's the alternative to doing something like long polling. The only difference is that some servers just don't support WebSockets. If you're using something like GoDaddy or some other shared host, you don't have access to WebSockets. So long polling can be a great alternative, especially if you don't have a ton of data to sync. Or maybe you don't have a ton of users either. Maybe you have 2 or 3 concurrent users at a time. This long polling would make sense. I have the loop at 5 seconds, which is really fast. You'd probably go with something more like maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes or even up to 30 minutes. Make it a lot faster or a lot slower than that. So you're not really hitting your server a ton, especially when you have a ton of connections or if you're doing a chat or something. If it's not one-on-one, meaning two connections, that chat could get really crazy, and your server's going to start getting hammered. You're basically DDoSing yourself with all these requests. But essentially, this is pretty straightforward. There's really not much to it. There's 3 routes. The first one isn't the all route, which just gets all of the tasks. And a task is just a title, a description, and whether or not it's completed. 2 strings and a Boolean, or an integer, 0 or 1. I do have some hidden fields here. I don't want to pass in all of the fields because I don't need the created at and updated at. You might have a task that maybe has the user who created it or all this other additional info, and you might not want to include that in each request, in which case this would be a great place to just chop some stuff off. If you're getting some user info like a profile, a password would be something you don't want to have on there. Maybe even any of the relationships that they have, you want to chop those out, you can do that here as well. By default, passwords and stuff like that are hidden anyway in Laravel and Lumen, so when you have a user model, that stuff's being chopped out. So once you actually get all the tasks, this is going to return an array or a collection. And because we're just doing a straight up return here, Lumen and Laravel will both say, oh, okay, you're trying to return a collection in a response. Let's just manipulate that and change it into JSON and make it a nice array. So our actual front end results from all this all method is just a big array of JSON. And then our front end just renders that JSON in a list, and that's really all we're doing. This next route is a post route, and that's for posting and the update to the actual task that we've targeted, in which case we're just passing through a request, and we're using the new features in Lumen and Laravel 5.2 to do a constructor injection. In this case, you'd probably use a controller for most of these, but in this case, we're just doing it here, cowboy style. We're also passing the ID that's being set in our URL. All we're just simply doing is finding that task that it belongs to, updating it with any of the data that we passed through, and then returning it. And it's just going to return a single item. So let's just hit one of these. So I just checked off that one, checked off number 3, and you can see that all I did was this is what I got back, the task that was created. The thing that I sent was the task before or now after I've manipulated it on the front end. So if we look here, our next route is the create route, which would be actual posting an event posting a task. All we're doing is simply passing in the request, and then we're just creating a new task with that request data and returning the task that was created, and then appending it to our list. So this isn't very exciting, and neither is the model. So we should jump to the front end where all the cool stuff is happening. So the first thing you'll see is a counter, and that simply is just counting how many requests I've made. I'm just doing that so you can see that things are happening here. You can see that it's going up every 5 seconds, I believe I have it on right now. That's too fast. You definitely want to change that. Here I have a nice little for loop. Vue has a nice for syntax for looping through an array, and this is basically the for each task, for a task in tasks. This is like JavaScript syntax for that sort of stuff. We also have a little checkbox here, which is bound up with a bunch of Vue stuff. The first thing is I'm binding it to the completed value of the task. And whenever I change that, I'm actually going to bind the value of this checkbox itself to either 1 or 0, which is the integer that my database is looking for. It's looking for a tiny int, so that'll be either 1 or 0. Whenever I change this state or this checkbox, I'm going to run a function, and I'm going to actually pass the task in itself. You could also pass just the task completed value or the value of this checkbox, but I'm actually going to pass the whole task in. It sort of cleans up the code and makes it really easy to read. Plus, you'd normally have probably a form wrapping around this task, and maybe you could tweak its title and its description. So you'd basically be passing in the task itself versus the actual single values. You can also see here I'm just echoing out the title and the description, pretty straightforward. So here's our form. So I have an action, a method, and an actual submit handler. So I always put inline action and methods here because there's a trick that I'll show you just as we go down that will actually help you with your submit forms for if JavaScript somehow got turned off. This form will still work as long as we have the appropriate or expected HTML or attributes that we would normally have in a form when you're not using JavaScript to submit things like via Ajax. As long as we have the action, the method, and the names on all of our elements, if somehow the JavaScript stopped working, we could still submit this form and it would actually still work. It would refresh the page or something would happen. It would either go to wherever this is supposed to be. In this case, it'd probably submit to the create, and then all it would do is just return a JSON array in your browser, and you'd be wondering what's going on. But you could handle that case where if you just chop all this off and handle it purely in JavaScript, you've now removed the functionality of submitting the form without JavaScript, which some people hate. Anyway, all we're doing is we have a empty object in our view data here that's just a task with no title, no description, and its completed value is false. And we're actually just putting that in here. So we have a model, it's the title, its name is title, it's a placeholder of title, pretty straightforward. Then we have another model here that's just the description. And as I change these different items, we're actually updating the instance of that task or that object on our Vue app. Then I have a submit button that just submits the form. So you can see we're using Vue 1016. That's whatever version the latest one is here. But let's jump down to our Vue app. So I always use named apps because then you can access them outside of the app itself. Sometimes I do like per page apps, like if I have a CMS and I'm working on the pages controller or something, or the pages view, I'll actually make a new app for that view. And then I'll pass in a bunch of mixins and stuff that are shared throughout the site. That's kind of my style. It's nice to be able to reference the app versus doing things like this where you have to reference the self all the time, or you have to do some really weird things with the call method on functions. But anyway, we're just wrapping the app, which is the ID of the body. So I'm just wrapping basically the entire site. So the first thing we have is an array of empty tasks. We also have a counter that starts at 0. We have the new task that's going to be a placeholder for any of the new form submissions. And we also have this ready function, which calls getData, and it passes in this callback. I'll jump down a little bit more, and we'll get to that later. We have this update task, which is what I talked about when you're actually posting for an update. And we're actually, remember, passing in that whole task. So up here, when we update the task, we're passing in an object, actually. So even though this is a string, literally, it'll actually get passed into whatever the object was that was in the loop at that time. In this case, I just called it target. So we get all the attributes that we could normally get on a task. In this case, we have IDs and stuff like that. And we can actually do other stuff here. So I'm using the fetch API, which is new. So the only dependency that this little front end has is Vue. That's it. All the other stuff is native in the browser. Fetch is a nice little wrapper or sort of like native solution for jQuery's $.ajax. You can see if you've done that before, this looks very familiar, except it's using promises style, I guess, continuing functionality. So whenever something is completed, we call the then method, which is part of the promises, and then we can do other stuff. As long as we're returning, we can keep chaining then do this, then do this. And it actually stops things like callback hell where you have like nested callbacks, and then you have to go all the way back up, and it's really hard to catch errors, blah, blah, blah. This video isn't about the benefits of promises, but that's one of the great ones about it. Anyways, we make a post request. We just pass in some data here, or sorry, here to here. And all that is just whatever our request is. In this case, it's just a post request like we saw in our route for creating or updating, sorry. Here's a post request. And then we have to set some headers. If you're using fetch, you should be setting the headers because they don't get set automatically. So if you just deleted this whole section and started posting, Laravel would start squawking, and so would Lumen, because it doesn't know that you're sending JSON. The body is just stringified version of the actual object itself. So this will be pretty much like this, except with whatever data you put into the form, which is pretty nice. So we just pass the whole thing, pass the whole form. Then, literally, we get that response, and we want to get the JSON of that response. So fetch has this thing where it returns a raw value. So you can either treat it as text or as JSON, and it has a nice little helper on the response method in the first then response to give you little helpers. So another one is text, and there's some other tricks that you can do with that, but that's sort of beyond the scope of this. So we go back to the next then method, which is the actual task itself, because we've got the response. In this case, it was just a single item of JSON, which was the new task that was created. So then all we do is assign the target or whatever we've passed in up here to the new task that we returned. That's it. The whole view will update just based on this. If there's any errors, catch them. That's the last thing. So that's pretty simple. That's just simply updating a task. Whenever I click a checkbox, maybe in the future you tweak this and add the title control or description control, you can do that as well. Here's a submitting of the form. So this is creating a new task. So the reason I mentioned having those nice little tricks of having real targets and real actions and real actions and real methods is that you can actually pass them in here versus hard coding a URL. So based on what I have right now, if I change a task, update it, I have a hard-coded URL here. There's no way I can really make this work nicely without having to wrap the whole thing in a form when there's no JavaScript. But this form will still submit. I can still create a new task even if JavaScript is disabled, because I'm using native actions and native methods on my actual form itself as these attributes here. So it knows where it's going, it knows what kind of method it's using. Other than that, that's all it really needs, and it just needs some properly named elements inside, and that'll be it. Anyway, again, we set the headers here. You could even set these headers via an object on your form. I have this other Vue component called Ajax form upload, where it lets you apply headers via the vbind syntax inside of Vue. We could use that. So this is pretty familiar. All we're doing is just stringifying the this new task, which would be whatever the value of these fields is. So we have these three fields: title, description, and task. Whatever the values are, stringify them in a nice little object and chuck them in the body. So we're stringifying them because fetch doesn't stringify natively. You have to. It's a very raw function, just like above here when we actually send the task itself. I can't just send JSON. I should actually just transform it into a string and throw it along. Same deal, very familiar. We just get the response, get the JSON of that response, or convert it as JSON, treat it as JSON, however you want to say it. That's what we're doing here. Then we're actually applying the new task to the array of tasks. We're actually pushing it onto the bottom. That's all we're doing here. We simply push it onto the bottom and it shows up in our list. The next thing we're doing is resetting the form. So you wouldn't want someone to keep submitting the same task over and over again. So all we're doing is submitting that form after we're done. That's really it. There's not much else here as far as Vue goes. The only thing we're really doing is sending some post requests, which isn't really that special to Vue. The great thing is that Vue has the Vue binding stuff, and I mean that VIEW binding stuff, where when you change something in our data, it updates our Vue automatically. So you could really just replace Vue with any sort of virtual DOM framework or even React or something like that if you really wanted to. I like the way that it works with native HTML, so I sort of stick with Vue, and it's very simple and straightforward. But let's actually jump to this ready function. So the first time I load a page, we actually have the page do our initial fetch, and that's what I'm doing right here. So whenever it's ready, just get the data, and we're passing in a callback here. So that's pretty important. So let's just jump through these things. So what's poll? Poll is a wrapper around itself. It's its own call. So what we're doing here is we're just recursively calling our getData method with a timeout of time of 5 seconds. So what that means is that every 5 seconds I'm going to run this. As soon as I run it the first time, I'm going to all of a sudden be stuck in here. So this is just going to keep going every 5 seconds. Now what are we actually doing here? GetData. So what's that? Well, GetData takes a callback or a function, and it actually just wraps this other method here, raw get. So let's jump up here and see what's going on here. So again, we're using fetch, and since fetch returns a promise, that's what we're doing here. We're fetching all of the tasks, converting it to JSON, and actually getting the response, and applying it to our tasks list. So here's one of the things where I said you should use a named Vue instance. You can do that here. You could put this in the Vue app if you wanted to. You just have to do some tricks with self and this call, so you can get things to wrap functions up nicely. But I kind of like doing it this way. It's really simple and straightforward because you know what you're talking about. You're talking about, you don't have to use the things like I'm talking about this, I mean this, this, this. You get kind of messed up. I'm talking about the app. The app is a instance of Vue. In this case, the only instance of Vue on our entire page. So we apply all of the list of tasks to our actual tasks inside of our list, and those apply here. They spit out right here. Pretty straightforward. Then we increment the counter, and we return as well. So I'm actually returning this whole thing. So you notice I don't have a catch here. It's because I'm actually going to use the catch over here. I'm catching right here in this get data function. And the reason it takes a callback is because you can see where the recursiveness comes in. So if I go through this timeout for the first time, I'm getting data and I'm passing poll. Well, poll is this function, so I'm actually passing it itself. So when that happens, it means when poll is then finished, we call it again. So this can stop things where maybe your timeout, or some people might use a set interval. So that the problem comes with set interval when your request takes longer than your interval's time is. So let's say you do a set interval, you want to do it every 5 seconds, but for some reason your request takes 10 seconds. Well, then we're going to have like double calls. And it's going to start, if your server's being slow, it's going to start doubling up on these intervals. In this case, we don't have that because we're only calling set timeout once we know that the response has been successfully returned. So let's actually see what happens when something doesn't happen. So we have our little app here, it's running. I'm actually going to increase the time just to 2 seconds, so it'll be a little bit faster. We'll see that counter going up pretty quickly now. There we go, 2, 3, so it's going along. So let's actually break the site. So in that loop that we're calling tasks all, so let's just return some gibberish. So we're going to cause a 500 error here. Let's see what happens. It broke. See, we got a red error here, internal server error. Let's see what happens. Yeah, we got this thing, unexpected blah blah blah. Let's see what the server says or the console says. There's just a log here. And so what happens is you can see that my whole loop has stopped. If I was on a set interval and not using sort of the convention of finding out when things are successfully completed, it might still just keep fetching, which maybe is what you want, but most likely you don't want that. You'd have to use some tricks with clear interval to actually clear the timeout so that you're not calling things even when there is an error. In this case, though, we don't have support for handling errors really. We're simply just doing our calls, and if an error happens, it just stops everything, which is maybe what you want. It's most likely what you want, and then you can just find a way to restart the loop once you've handled that error or not. So in this case, we're just going to refresh. Everything should be back to normal since we fixed that 500 error, and you can see that everything's working now. So there's not really much to it. The main thing is that it's just a loop that is hitting our server and returning an array of the tasks or array of the items or whatever resource we're getting and applying them to the view. So the magic actually comes with applying this stuff to the view, because we actually have this little loop here that will only change when the array itself that gets returned from our server is changed. So if I don't touch this page, there's no real reason for anything to re-render. It just sits there. It doesn't re-render anything. It just doesn't even change. It taps it. You can see there's not really much going on. But we're not actually changing anything. It's just sitting there. There's no reason for this to change. But when I actually do make a change, like uncheck a box, then it actually is going to make that change for everyone else that's on the server as well. So we can definitely handle it that way. There's other little tricks with using caching and stuff like that, because you probably wouldn't want to just keep returning all when there's nothing changed. So you would probably set a cache, maybe just like a 5-minute cache, or another cool thing would be to create a named cache key, and then whenever a task is updated or created, you clear that cache key, and then you return the new set of all tasks. Or maybe after someone creates a task or updates a task, you would actually recache the all variable, or the all array that comes out here. You can actually do that pretty easily. So in which sense you're actually even reducing what gets returned here. You could even do something here in your front end where maybe you're only returning on something like request idle callback. That's maybe you're replacing set timeout with request idle callback. And what request idle callback does is it looks for time to schedule things. So it's kind of like request animation frame where it tries to get to 60 frames per second, except with request idle callback, they're actually looking to see when there's free time on the page so that it can actually do its computation or whatever you want it to do. So that would be pretty great to have the browser only do work when you need to. Or you could even say, hey, are you idle? Because if you're idle, don't bother checking if there's any updates. Or, hey, am I focused on the tab? Because if I'm not focused on the tab, don't check if there's any updates. In which case, the way that using this sort of recursive method, we can just stop the timeout in some way, or we can pause it. We can tell it to stop. We can do different tricks like that. In this case, you might actually return the set timeout so we can clear it every time. So we could change it, or maybe we use like a named timeout in a different way, or a named function that's here and cause it to stop. In which case we know, hey, are you if you're not looking at the window, so we wrap this with a guard saying, hey, if you're not looking at the window, don't bother starting the timeout. And then have another event saying, hey, this tab is now focused. Let's start the loop again and start fetching everything. So the real reason that you'd use this, or the reason you'd want to use this, is if you have a small little app that maybe is just having data, periodically throughout your page. Maybe you're updating some weather thing or whatever. You don't necessarily need to have real-time quote-unquote results. So a chat might not be the best case for something like this. You're probably better off using sockets. But if you have something like a little list, or maybe you have two users editing the same page in a CMS, you might want to say when someone goes to save, you could do a little check saying, hey, this page has actually been updated. You should probably save your stats. Or even you could tell the front end, hey, don't save this page overwriting the other person's work. Save it as a new page or something like that. So you can handle these cases where someone hasn't actually refreshed the page, but data has changed in your database, and you actually don't know that. At least the user doesn't know that. And so when they go to save something, you could handle a case where there's a conflict where something's been updated, but it hasn't necessarily been reflected in the front end. We could even show a little notice saying, hey, this page has changed, you should refresh it. Or there's a new blog post under here, don't save, or something like that. You could do some nice messaging like that. So polling is really great when you have no access to WebSockets, or you don't need to run a secondary server like something like Node with Socket.io. Or even if you're just kind of cheap and you don't want to have to pay for a real-time server or some sort of service that lets you do polling, you can do it with these little tricks with set timeouts and Ajax requests. Cool.